9. Massive artifact collections. In 2010, as the 99th anniversary of the Titanic disaster approached, a replica of the ship's fourth tunnel was towed along the River Thames in London to memorialize the tragedy and to launch a new exhibition of artifacts that were recovered from the wreck. The collection of 300 items consisted of personal belongings as well as parts of the ship, including the crow's nest bell. An even bigger trove of artifacts was slated to go to auction in 2012, 100 years after the sinking. It consisted of 5,000 objects that were amassed by an avid collector and had been valued at around $189 million back in 2007, according to CNN. The auction house responsible for the sale, Premier Exhibitions, announced that it planned to sell the entire collection as one lot, rather than to auction pieces off separately. The items were gathered over several dives that took place between 1987 and 2010, and included deck chairs, silverware, a bronze cherub from the Grand Concourse, and a violin that was played during the sinking, and a letter written in the final hours before the ship went under. According to plans, the auction would happen on April 11th and the winner would be announced on April 15th, the anniversary of the sinking. But it appears as though the auction was delayed not once, but twice, and it still hadn't happened as of 2018. By then, Premier Exhibitions had declared bankruptcy, and it was finally announced later that year that the collection would be sold to cover some of the company's debts. 8. The wreck is vanishing. Experts have known for several years now that what's left of the Titanic could disappear in the near future. For 110 years, since 1912, the wreck has been sitting on the ocean floor at the frigid depth of 2.5 miles, 4 kilometers below the water's surface. The darkness and cold temperatures kept it relatively well preserved until its discovery in 1985, but the iconic ship is visibly deteriorating, and it's happening at an alarming rate. In 2010, scientists discovered a new type of proteobacteria on rusticles recovered from the wreckage. Dubbed Halomonas titanicae, it may be largely responsible for the Titanic's rapid decay. The metal-eating bacteria survive with remarkable ease at the shipwreck's depth and are eagerly consuming hundreds of pounds of the ship every day. Deep-sea currents and salt erosion are also destroying the sunken vessel. Parts of the wreck have disappeared completely, including its 100-foot, 30.5-meter forward mast and the crow's nest. The poop deck, where panicked passengers clamored as the ship went down, has folded in, and the gymnasium near the grand staircase has completely collapsed. In 2016, experts estimated that the entire wreck will be gone by 2030. All along, they knew the Titanic would eventually vanish, but they didn't think so until recently that it would happen so soon. Divers visited the wreck in 2019 for the first time in 14 years and confirmed that the wreck is in an advanced and ever-worsening state of deterioration. Last year, exploration company Ocean Gate Expeditions announced that a team was traveling to the site to document what's left of the Titanic before it disintegrates completely. Another expedition is planned for July of this year. 7. Panicked passengers sped up the sinking. The Titanic hit an iceberg around midnight on April 15, 1912, instantly causing water to flood into the ship. Panic ensued as passengers opened their portholes to try figuring out why the ship had ground to an abrupt halt, and this ultimately sped up the sinking of the vessel, according to British author and historian Tim Moulton, who spent 6 years studying survivors' first-hand accounts of the catastrophe. During an exclusive interview with Science Digest, Moulton explained that at the disaster's onset, there was roughly a ton, 1.1 US tons of water flooding into the ship every second. The amount was exacerbated by the fact that many of the passengers had opened their windows to see what was going on, never closed them before leaving their cabins and heading up to the deck. Moulton believes that the open portholes doubled the amount of damage to the sinking Titanic and may have caused it to sink twice as fast as it otherwise would have. It took 3 hours for the ship to go completely under, but it was clear within minutes that something had gone terribly wrong. While the Titanic was designed to be able to float with up to 4 of its 16 watertight compartments filled, it began tilting at a 45-degree angle just 10 minutes after striking the iceberg. This put enormous strain on the vessel's steel framework, as the water that poured inside made the ship even heavier, causing the stern to rise completely out of the water and the Titanic to eventually break in half. Sadly, as Moulton pointed out, it seems as though it was too late to avoid the tragedy itself. By the time the crew had spotted the iceberg, they had less than a minute to avoid hitting it, and for a ship that size, that's an incredibly narrow time frame. 6. What happened to the bodies? Most of the 1,500 people who died during the sinking of the Titanic were left at the scene. Just 337 bodies were pulled from the water by the crews of the 4 vessels that were tasked with recovering human remains, and 114 of them were ultimately returned to the water. In a recent study, scholar Jess Beer set out to determine what was done with the recovered bodies and the criteria that the recovery crews used for deciding which bodies to retrieve. She found that the victims' economic class played a major role in the decision of whether to bury them at sea, and that third-class ticket holders were much more likely to be put back in the water. The class distinctions among the Titanic's passengers and how the upper classes viewed the lower classes were made famous in the movie. But many of the differences shown in the film were largely based on theory, and there are limits to what we know about the class disparity at the time. Beer's findings are helping to paint a clearer picture of the inequalities that existed, both on the ship and in society, making rumors about steerage passengers being locked below deck seem even more believable, and perhaps even helping to explain the overwhelmingly high survival rate of first-class passengers. The somewhat recent advent of life insurance also factored into decisions about which bodies to recover. In that sense, a literal monetary value was assigned to wealthier victims, thereby giving them priority. Middle and lower class victims were deemed far less likely to have burial coverage, and were for the most part simply discarded back into the water. Recovery crews determined each person's class based on their clothing, any belongings found on them, and their physical characteristics. Those identified as being first class were embalmed and placed in coffins. Second class victims were embalmed, wrapped in canvas, and placed in a separate storage area, and third class individuals were not embalmed and were left on deck with plans to bury them at sea in group ceremonies. What do you think of the Titanic burials being based on class? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 5. Mystery victim identified. On April 21, 1912, 5 days after the Titanic sank, a rescue crew pulled the body of a light-featured toddler from the water. The little boy was buried along with several other victims at a cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and his grave was marked with a stone that simply read "Unknown Child." A century later, in 2012, researchers announced that they believed they'd finally identified the child as 19-month-old Sydney Leslie Goodwin from England. The findings were initially met with caution, since the toddler had been incorrectly identified twice before. But the results were more reliable this time round. In 2001, Ontario-based ancient DNA expert Ryan Parr began to wonder if there was still any interest in identifying nameless Titanic victims. At the time, it was still believed that the child was likely a Swedish boy named Gustav Leonard Palsson. His remains were exhumed with permission from the child's surviving relatives, and it was soon found that his mitochondrial DNA did not match that of his family members. Members of the project tracked down living relatives of 5 other missing boys who were under the age of 3 when the Titanic sank. Using mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from mothers to their offspring, the team eliminated all but 2 of the boys. They then examined the toddler's teeth and ruled out the older of the remaining 2 possibilities, concluding that the child was Sydney Leslie Goodwin. The findings were challenged by some, who believed that a pair of the boy's shoes that had ended up at a museum were far too big for a child of Goodwin's age. But DNA once again proved that the team had correctly identified him. Goodwin's remains were relocated to Wisconsin, where his surviving relatives reburied him and held a memorial ceremony. 4. Phony survivor. 2-year-old Lorraine Allison was traveling on the Titanic with her parents and younger brother Trevor when it sank. Trevor survived, but Lorraine's mother and father perished in the sinking. It was long thought that she too had died, but her body was never found. In 1940, a woman named Helen Kramer claimed that she was Lorraine Allison and that her father had placed her in a lifeboat just in time to save her. She said she fell under the care of a man named Mr. Hyde, who she claimed was actually the Titanic's designer and builder, Thomas Andrews. According to Kramer, he raised her as his own, but never formally adopted her while living under an alias to avoid persecution for the mass tragedy. Kramer's assertions were pretty bold, especially since Andrews was believed to have gone down with the ship. For the next several decades, Kramer and her granddaughter, Debrina Woods, tried to convince living members of the Allison family that they were long-lost relatives. The mystery was still unsolved when Kramer passed away in 1992, but Woods remained hopeful that DNA would prove her identity. At one point, she claimed she had documents proving the connection, but the family never released the alleged records. A mitochondrial DNA analysis was eventually performed, and in 2014, the scientist announced that there was no genetic connection between Kramer and Allison's family members. The findings support the original belief that Allison drowned when the Titanic sank. But Woods was unwilling to accept this and reportedly claimed that she believed the DNA samples had been tampered with. 3. Don't blame the messenger. When the Titanic's crew called for help after the ship hit an iceberg, the telegraph operator on the only nearby ship, the SS Californian, was asleep. Cyril Evans, who went to bed at around 11:30 that night, a half hour before the deadly collision, has historically been shamed for snoozing through the Titanic's distress calls. An official US inquiry even found that if Evans had stayed awake for just a little while longer, the Californian could have come to the rescue from just miles away, and far more people would have survived. But the desperate passengers aboard the Titanic had to wait for another ship, the Carpathia, to come from 60 miles, 97 kilometers away. By the time it arrived, the ship had sank, and some 1,500 people had lost their lives. The Californian eventually made its way to the scene, much later than it arguably could have if Evans had been manning his telegraph station. But a historian named Park Stevenson believes that Evans deserves some slack, and announced earlier this year that he doesn't think the disgraced telegraph operator could have done anything to lessen the Titanic's death toll. Stevenson admitted that Evans acted unprofessionally, but pointed out that at the time, telegraph stations aboard ships were not required to be manned 24 hours a day. Additionally, when the Californian finally did head toward the Titanic, it took the ship more than 2 hours to navigate its way out of some ice and into open waters, which would have probably taken much longer at night, according to Stevenson. Simply put, he believes it's unlikely that the Californian could have reached the disaster any faster than the Carpathia, even if it was closer to the scene. But Evans isn't completely off the hook. Earlier that night, he'd failed to properly send a message warning nearby ship captains of ice. It would have been the heads up that the Titanic needed to avoid the disaster altogether. 2. Furniture built with the Titanic's wood. Near the northern Irish city of Belfast, there's a city that contains furniture made from the same wood that was used to build the Titanic. Built in 1833 by a prominent local family called the Deramores, the 4-bedroom home has a kitchen window seat that was made sometime after 1909 from timber that was salvaged from the Harland and Wolff shipyard. The historic luxury property once functioned as a post office and was carefully restored before hitting the market in 2019 at the asking price of £439,500, $548,891. It's unclear whether the house was sold, but the listing has been taken down, so it's probably safe to assume that someone bought it and is perhaps enjoying it as a vacation home. Ireland shares a unique history with the Titanic. Not only was the ship built there, 113 Irish passengers boarded at Queenstown near Cork. Only 40 of them made it to the US. 1. Never-before-seen photographs. In 2019, the Lough S Castle Hotel in Donegal, Ireland, opened a new pub called the Father Brown Bar. Located in the northern part of the country, its walls are adorned with more than 200 rare photos from the Titanic that had never been seen by the public prior to the bar's opening. The pictures were taken by an Irish Jesuit priest and photographer named Francis Brown, whom the business is named after. His ticket aboard the Titanic's maiden voyage was a gift from his uncle. Brown took hundreds of photographs during his first days on the ship as it traveled from Southampton, England to Queenstown, Ireland, capturing images of passengers, staff, and the vessel's extravagant spaces and cabins. Right before the Titanic departed from Ireland to cross the Atlantic, Brown received a telegram from his church superiors ordering him to get off the ship, presumably for work-related reasons. Little did he or his superiors know, the instructions likely saved his life. After the Titanic sank, the last photographs Brown took of it appeared on the front pages of newspapers around the world. But most of the pictures in the Father Brown Bar were never seen before its grand opening, because although Brown was a career photographer, he couldn't afford to develop all of his film. A few years ago, the hotel's owner bought several of Brown's trunks at auction and discovered undeveloped rolls of film inside. The photos were processed and remastered, and the owner was kind enough to share them with the public by decorating his bar with them.
Number 10. The Rainbow Pool. If we asked you to look for a colorful rainbow, you'd most likely cast your gaze up to the sky above. Where you probably wouldn't think to look would be the forest floor. Brent Rawson and his girlfriend were talking about a romantic walk through First Landing State Park in Virginia in November 2018 when they came across a bizarre rainbow pool. Stretching out in front of them between the trunks of the trees were waves of color reflected on the water that flowed through the marshy forest. It looked like something straight out of a fairy tale. But what caused this unusual rainbow phenomenon? Jeff Ripple, a former Florida swamp walk leader, said in an interview with the BBC, "The rainbow sheens found as a thin film on top of pooled water in swamps and marshes are the result of natural oils released by decaying vegetation or the biological processes of anaerobic bacteria reducing iron in the soil." Jeff further explained that the water needs to be still for long periods in order for the rainbows to appear. Movement by sheet flow, current, or wind disturbance would destroy the fragile rainbow film, he said. So if you ever come across a rainbow pool, be sure to take a few pictures. Number 9. The abandoned wooden Russian house. Standing among the trees in the district of Kostroma Oblast in Russia is a creepy abandoned house that looks like it's full of ghosts. It's believed that the house was built by an industrialist named Markov at the end of the 19th century. It served as his dacha, a term used for the second homes of wealthy individuals that were often located in the suburbs of big cities. The house has 2 floors with a tower and an ornate pavilion out in the front yard. As you get closer, you'll notice beautifully carved details with red windows surrounded by geometric designs and an intricate roof edging that almost looks like it's made of lace. Although the house appears to be in good condition, it's pretty clear to see that it has not been lived in for a long time. Some planks have come loose and are falling off, and inside the ceiling and walls are cracked with the furniture long gone. This house isn't the only one in this location though, although it's set apart from the others. In fact, this was once the site of an entire village which has since been abandoned. But why was this beautiful house abandoned? And where did everyone go? We don't know for sure, but it's believed that as developments grew in other areas of Russia offering better opportunities, the people gradually began moving away, leaving their homes behind. This was a common practice at the time, as often villages that were seen as unpromising would be closed down, meaning that the people would relocate to better areas. Thankfully, in recent years, this house was saved and rebuilt by a Russian entrepreneur and is now open as a forest hotel and museum to allow you to explore and learn more about the area itself. Number 8. The Wishing Trees. In the woodlands in the UK, there are multiple tree trunks studded with coins that have been hammered into the bark. Often these are just long dead stumps, but on other occasions this odd practice has taken place on a living tree. But why would someone go out of their way to hammer the contents of their piggy bank into a tree? The reason people do this relates to a tradition of wishing trees. The concept of a wishing tree goes back centuries. The first occurrences we know about are in the early 18th century, over 300 years ago. It's unclear how the custom first started or by whom, but given the fact that you can find these wishing trees all over the country, it seems that it was a pretty popular thing to do. If someone was feeling ill, they might hammer a coin into the bark in the hope that the illness goes with it. It's believed that if someone was then greedy enough to take the coin out, they would get sick instead. Others would choose sturdy trees such as beech and holly trees to place their coins into, with the belief that if they were able to make it past the bark and into the wood of the tree trunk, their wish would come true. The tradition of a wishing tree is common in many countries across the world, such as in Japan, where people will write paper wishes and hang them in the branches. Number 7. An abandoned Soviet helicopter. Deep in the Russian wilderness, about 1,490 miles from Moscow, is an abandoned Mi-6 helicopter that's been sitting in a boggy swamp for over 40 years. The helicopter has a light gray fuselage with long rotors, all of which are still attached, although one is perilously close to the trunk of a nearby tree. Its engines have been stripped, and its tailpiece is missing. But aside from this, its condition is fairly good given its location. But why is it all the way out here? Believe it or not, it has nothing to do with a conflict or being shot down in battle. It's here because of a simple mistake. The Mi-6 helicopter and its 5-man crew were making a refueling stop nearby on the way to prospect for oil. Once the tank was filled, they set off again, but they were only in the air for about 5 minutes before their engines failed and they plummeted into the swamp below. The reason for their crash is that the refueling crew had mistakenly filled the helicopter with gasoline mixed with water. Thankfully, all of the crew survived, but it goes to show that it's super important to fill up with the right fuel the next time you're out at the pumps. Number 6. The humongous fungus. The sweetly named honey mushroom really isn't as adorable as the name sounds. It's actually quite a killer. The only issue is that you probably won't even know it's there unless you know what you're looking for. Located in the Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon, the honey mushroom is the largest single living organism on the planet. Throughout the fall season, small clusters of golden brown mushrooms sprout up from the ground at the base of a few unlucky trees. You might be wondering how something so small holds a record for being so big. The reason for this is that all of these mushrooms are part of the same living organism, and most of it is underground. As of 2015, it spanned an area of 3 square miles, and it's slowly but surely killing off the forest above. Once the fungus has taken hold, a tree can take decades to die as it's taken over from the inside. The honey mushroom will emerge from underground right underneath the tree, spreading up through the trunk. The unfortunate tree will try to fight it by pushing it out of holes in its bark. These attempts are futile though, as all the while the fungus is eating away at the tissue of the tree, turning it white and gooey inside. Not only does the attack take place on the inside, but the mushroom now has the tree surrounded. Talk about a slow and painful way to go. It's okay though, as the Oregon honey mushroom plays the waiting game quite well. It's estimated to be between 2,000 and 8,000 years old. Number 5. Fairy doors. All over the world, you can find trees with fairy doors. These colorful doors come in all shapes and sizes, often brightly colored with decorations including flowers, butterflies, and leaves. Fairy doors are said to be portals between our world and the fairy realm. Often they're used by children to help to feed their imaginations. Some little ones also find they help them to deal with bad dreams or take their worries away. Fairies have existed in many cultures dating back hundreds of years. For example, in the Irish countryside, they'll often travel through fairy rings or fairy forts. Ireland has lots of close links to fairies, as in Irish folklore they're seen as one of the founding tribes. You might think of fairies as being cute and innocent, but fairies of old would often be considered mischievous creatures that sometimes steal children through their fairy doors and take them to the fairy realm. Nowadays, fairies have a much sweeter reputation, and people will install fairy doors so that the magic creatures can visit them. For example, in the town of Ann Arbor in Michigan in 1993, a number of fairy doors popped up overnight on various trees, much to the local community's delight. Although it's doubtful that fairies actually exist, many find comfort in leaving them gifts or writing letters to them to pop behind their doors. Have you ever seen a fairy door? Let us know in the comments below and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 4. The stairs to nowhere. Traipsing your way through the woods of New Hampshire, stone walls start to appear in front of you. The gray, mossy rocks form arches at the base, but more curiously on top of the wall is a staircase that curves around at almost a 90-degree angle before suddenly stopping in midair. This is the stairs to nowhere. Locals have a different name for this structure and refer to the ruins as Madame Sherry's castle. But who was Madame Sherry, and why did she have a castle out here in the middle of the woods? The truth of the matter is that there wasn't exactly a castle here. Instead, there was once a mansion built by a famous costume designer from the 1920s, Antoinette Sherry. Originally hailing from New York, Madame Sherry bought up land in the forests of New Hampshire to build a summer retreat. Sherry's castle was home to many lavish parties. The hostess herself would often drive around the area in a custom-made Packard car in a luxurious cream color, whilst her pet monkey perched on her shoulders. Unfortunately, her ambition was bigger than her purse strings. Eventually, Madame Sherry abandoned the property, letting it be reclaimed by the wilderness. The answer as to why there's only a staircase left comes down to a fire that ravaged the ruins in 1962. As the site was abandoned, it fell prey to local vandals, who sadly set it on fire. As a result, only the stone features such as this grand staircase remained. One thing is for sure, Madame Sherry's masterpiece still attracts visitors to this day. Even the famous lady herself can be spotted paying a visit to her old summer home. Sometimes passers-by have spotted the ghostly figure of a rather well-dressed woman standing on the staircase. Number 3. The longest railway tunnel in the world. The Forest of Dean in the UK is a large nature reserve and area of natural beauty which spans from Gloucester in England across the border into Wales. Its size is not the only vast thing about it though, as it also houses what was once the longest railway tunnel in the world. Its size might not seem all that impressive nowadays though, as the High Tunnel is only 1,083 yards long. But you have to remember that it was built in 1810, at a time long before commercial rail travel was a thing. Originally, the tunnel would have had horse-drawn carriages running through it to transport important goods such as coal between the two countries. Later on, the tunnel was widened by legendary engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel, so that passenger-carrying steam trains could run through it. Renovating what was still an incredibly groundbreaking tunnel yet again was not easy, given the fact that Brunel had already helped to design and construct most of the railroad between the southwest of England and London by this time. He was the best man for the job. Trains and horses and carts weren't the only travelers through the tunnel. School children would often use the tunnel as a handy shortcut to get to class in the neighboring town and would have to avoid the trains that went speeding past them. Brunel's work stood the test of time as the tunnel stayed in use until the 1960s, when the line fell victim to Beeching's rail cuts, which put a stop to many railways up and down the country. Since then, it's been reclaimed by the forest. During the COVID lockdown, Alex Watkins and Max Jones decided to find all the entrances and exits to this famous tunnel, documenting what they found in a series of photographs. They join many of the intrepid explorers that venture off the beaten path to clamber through its bricked-up entrance to explore this piece of industrial history. Number 2. Vintage pickup trucks. In a U.S. woodland, 9 Chevrolet pickup trucks were left parked up among the trees. The crazy thing is, every single one of them is up for sale. Granted, they're not exactly in top condition as they've been left out in the elements for over 50 years. A lot of the paint has rusted away, and we can bet you anything you like that all of their engines have long since seized up. That means they won't be driving out of there anytime soon. Despite all this though, they're still rather desirable. These vintage motors come from the popular advanced design era of the 1940s and 50s. One in good condition will set you back $50,000. But how much would you pay for a literal rust bucket? Realizing some of the hidden value of these cars, one explorer offered the owner of the vehicles, yes, they are owned and not abandoned, $10,000 for the entire group of 9 pickups. We think that's a pretty good deal, don't you? However, the owner declined and wanted $5,000 per truck. To the best of our knowledge, they remain unsold. So if you're in the market for an albeit rusty piece of automotive history, why not head down and make an offer? Number 1. Barnes Old Cemetery. Barnes Old Cemetery is located on the outskirts of West London. You could easily walk past the brushwood it's located in quite easily without even knowing it's there. However, if you step inside, you'll be greeted by something that seems to come out of a fantasy landscape, with gnarled yew trees sprawling through and an area abundant with flora. A path stretches between the gravestones, framed by trees creating an elegant archway. Most of the graves are in a state of disrepair, with a lot of the names barely legible. The cemetery was opened in 1857, and as the population of London rapidly expanded, people needed more places to bury their loved ones. The graveyard has a few notable residents, including a founding member of the Football Association of England, Ebenezer Cobb Morley, graves of fallen soldiers from both of the World Wars, and, most curiously, the remains of Julia Martha Thomas, who was murdered by her maid, Kate Webster. She was dismembered, and for a long time, the location of her head was unknown. That was until a century later, when it was uncovered in the garden of famous naturalist Sir David Attenborough. A more spooky visitor to the cemetery was Spring-Heeled Jack. 3 Victorian ladies had been walking through the area in September 1837. They'd been enjoying their time until they claimed that a human-like creature with glowing eyes had attacked them, leaving their clothes in tatters. Spring-Heeled Jack, as he became known, then started to appear in other parts of London over the coming months. Multiple reports claimed he could jump over very long distances with ease, leading to the nickname and adding to the superstition around him further. Despite many theories, no one knows who or what he truly was. Eventually, Barnes Old Cemetery was closed in 1966. At the time of this video, the local council has no plans to renovate or restore the site, and in a way, we quite like that. Number 8. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. In the 1940s and the 1950s, prefrontal lobotomies were performed on more than 40,000 patients in the United States, and one location that performed them was the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It would later be known as Weston State Hospital. The hospital was built to shelter 250 individuals, opened to patients in 1864, and peaked in the 1950s with 2,400 patients. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic was designed to be self-sufficient, including a farm, dairy, waterworks, and cemetery on their land. It eventually grew to 666 acres. Patients were brought to the institution for different reasons, including asthma, sloth, egotism, family problems, and even avarice. This resulted in an overabundance of patients being admitted, forcing the facility to run out of personnel and beds. In the early 1950s, Weston State Hospital became the site of the West Virginia Lobotomy Project. The state attempted to use lobotomy to lower the number of patients. Changes in the treatment of mental illness, as well as the facility's physical degradation, caused its closure in 1994. wreaking havoc on the local economy from which it has yet to recover. Joe Jordan purchased the hospital in 2007 and has offered it for tours and other activities to collect funds for its renovation. Number 7. Holy Land, USA. In the early 1950s, a dream started for John Baptist Greco, a devoted Roman Catholic. He took his dream of building a roadside religious theme park and put it into motion. By the end of the decade, he managed to build it. It was a representation of the city of Bethlehem in miniature. Over 50,000 people visited Holy Land only a few years after its opening. People came from far and wide to see a recreation of the Garden of Eden and other attractions based on biblical passages. His goal was to bring the community together by building a peaceful place dedicated to the life and work of Jesus Christ. It sits on Pine Hill in Waterbury, Connecticut. One of the park's most treasured staples is its steel cross, standing at 56 feet. The cross and the sign reading Holy Land, USA are two of their best-known features. Greco closed the park in 1984, hoping to update it. But unfortunately, he passed away in 1986 before he was able to do so. It was passed on to a group of nuns, and they kept it clean to the best of their abilities, but the park remained closed for good. Sadly, troubled kids had started making their mark on Holy Land by beheading statues, destroying dioramas, and blocking tunnels. It reached a more dangerous level in 2010 after a woman was killed there, making it a murder scene. The place underwent refurbishment in 2018. A massive cleanup was done and a new LED cross was put on display that changes colors to reflect certain holidays or seasons. In 2020, it was announced that while the Holy Land is still not open to the public, visitors are more than welcome to walk through the park and look around. Number 6. 1948 Buick Streamliner. The 1948 Norman E. Timms Buick Special Streamliner, one of the most notable and inventive vintage customs, was destroyed in the terrible Woolsey fire near Malibu, California. The Timms Special, known for its swooping mid-engine style, was destroyed with roughly 30 other automobiles owned by noted collector Gary Cervini. As the fire raged through the north of Los Angeles, Gary lost his whole collection. The car, which was later called the 1948 Buick Streamliner in the 1940s, was made by Norman E. Timms, who also designed and built the original Model T Ford Model A, which won the Model A World War II Car of the Year award in 1947. The Timms Special won awards at the Pebble Beach and Amelia Island Concours d'Elegance, and it was even transformed into a die-cast model. It was also a regular feature at Southern California vehicle events, where its oddly elegant design drew a lot of attention. Days following the fire at Cervini's 21,000-square-foot home, the media promptly reported that his home and the entire car collection were a complete write-off. Cervini's Magnaflux Streamliner was saved from destruction by the LA fires of 1991 when he and his wife were out of town and the fire department failed to respond to the blaze. The fire department never showed up because their house wasn't a priority, he says. Cervini intends to use the chassis as the basis for his second restoration of the car. Number 5. Ludlow, Colorado. Over 8,000 Colorado workers in the coal mining industry got together to form a union. They worked for the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, owned by the Rockefellers. The employees felt that they were not only underpaid, but that they also worked and lived in poor conditions, so they went on strike. The response from the company was to kick the workers out of town, but they stood their ground and set up tent colonies right next to the mines. The company hired National Guardsmen to reduce the violence between the miners and the corporation, yet they still terrorized and ran raids daily on the workers. In 1914, things came to a head, with the militia aiming fire. The miners responded to the shooting, resulting in an all-day affair. At the end of the day, the guardsmen torched the tent colony, burning it completely to the ground. Sadly, 11 children and 2 women were discovered dead from apparent smoke inhalation. Of the 25 people who died during the massacre, 3 of those were National Guard troops. The massacre caused a very dark turn in U.S. labor relations in which miners attacked anti-union officials, strikebreakers, and the mines while taking control of an area that was 50 miles long and 5 miles wide. About 50 people were killed during the retaliation for the Ludlow massacre. President Woodrow Wilson sent in federal troops to minimize any further violence. The workers' strike finally ended on December 10, 1914. The employees saw no significant difference in pay, but they recruited 4,000 new workers. Can you think of any other union strikes that happened throughout history? Mention them in the comments below and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 4. Cornish Estate Ruins. The Cornish Estate, a piece of New York history consisting of jagged stone, a stacked fireplace, and overgrown charm, sits in the woods in the Hudson Valley. Newlyweds Edward and Selina Cornish moved into the estate just outside the city in 1917. As president of the National Lead Company, Edward did well for himself and Selina. This allowed them to fill the estate with gardens, a swimming pool, and a prestigious mansion. Between 1920 and 1930, they often entertained guests with extravagant parties, giving them a place to escape from the bustling city life, even if it was just for a night. Tragedy struck in May 1938 when the lovers passed away within 2 weeks of each other. The estate was passed down to a nephew, but he never maintained the property, and in 1958 a fire destroyed most of the mansion. In the 1960s, it became part of Hudson Highlands State Park. A 2-mile hike is all it takes to get to the ruins, which are now overgrown and quickly becoming part of the forest. It's interesting to think that at one time the place was lively with music and dancing and laughter. Today, it's far from silent. People have claimed to hear the sounds of laughter and toasting glasses, a sign that the guests are still partying on the other side. Number 3. Plum Island Pink House, or the Spite House. Located in Newbury, Connecticut, an abandoned home sits out in the middle of nowhere atop a salt marsh. Its light pink color reminds people of a pretty sunset. The house is very popular with residents and has become famous in its little town as a local monument. Despite all of this, the beautiful scenery comes with an interesting tale. According to local mythology, it's known as the Spite House, a divorced man's history of having the last word on his ex-wife. The house was built in the 1920s when a local couple was completing their divorce. The woman demanded that her husband build an exact copy of their family house for her as part of the divorce agreement. Luck was not on her side because she didn't specify where she'd like it to be built. He agreed to her terms and went ahead and built the home as she requested. Under normal conditions, it would have been considered a kind gesture if he hadn't deliberately placed it on a secluded salt marsh. Salt water ran through the plumbing instead of fresh water, purportedly rendering the house uninhabitable. The home was used as a holiday getaway and was occupied by several different families after it was sold in the 1940s. It's been empty since the early 2000s. Prey birds such as hawks, vultures, and snowy owls are the sole visitors to the dwelling. There were plans to tear the house down, but a group called Support the Pink House gathered the community together in an effort to save an important part of local history. The group investigated the old tale in 2017 but found nothing to back up the outdated legend. The couple, Henry and Ruth Cutter, did live together in the house, and there's no evidence that suggests that there's another one identical to it. In November 1925, it's believed that Henry duped his wife into moving into the house with their baby under the premise that they would be living a good life together, only to leave them alone for long periods of time. It's alleged that she was left with nothing at all while he went to see another woman or have dinner with his mother. Only a few weeks after they moved in, Ruth had enough and moved to her mother's house with her baby, but not before leaving the bed made for her husband. It was reported that it took nearly a decade for the divorce to be finalized, that he left her in poor living conditions, and that she often had to ask for rides into town from a neighbor. Number 2. Chicken Church. Daniel Alamjah was going about his business when he got a heavenly word from God telling him to build a prayer home in the shape of a dove. He felt the deep jungle of Magdalang, Indonesia would be ideal. That was about 400 miles away from his home. In 1989, he was in the region since his wife's relatives lived there. He was out on a walk when he saw the precise site in his vision and remained there all night praying, knowing it was the exact spot he needed to build his prayer house. It was originally named Gereja Ayam, but because of its appearance, large bird-like head and ornamental tail feathers, it was dubbed Chicken Church. By the early 1990s, it was open and ready to accept visitors. The church brought any religion under its wing, such as Muslims, Christians, and Buddhists. It wasn't just a sanctuary for religion. It also provided rehabilitation and juvenile outreach programs. By the early 2000s, he was unable to finish the project due to there being no money left. Daniel sadly had to leave his dream behind, and nature started to take over the Chicken Church. As the years went by, it became part of the forest, rotting along the way. Word eventually got around about the behemoth bird in the woods, and tourists from far and wide came to see what the fuss was all about. Money was put into it, the graffiti was cleaned up, and artists painted the inner walls with murals that tell stories ranging from history to mythology. A cafe in the back of the Chicken Church sells delicious desserts. And if you're feeling adventurous, you can climb to the top of the chicken's head and take in the breathtaking views. Number 1. Elkmont Historic District. Elkmont is a vacant little village that lies in the Great Mountains in Tennessee. In 1908, it started out as a logging town under the eye of the Little River Lumber Company. The company logged the great majority of the Smoky Mountains. Many homeowners spent a significant amount of time cutting down the trees that surrounded their homes. In 1910, the Little River Company began selling some of the land to fishing and hunting fanatics from Knoxville. These men turned it into a vacation town equipped with cottages and a lodge, and it eventually became known as the Appalachian Club. Shortly after that, in 1912, the Wonderland Park Hotel was built, which overlooked Elkmont. It had 50 rooms complete with every modern comfort a person could want or need. For the next 2 decades, Elkmont was on the up and up, becoming an exclusive vacation town for Tennessee's wealthiest. In the 1930s, cottage owners were given lifetime leases for half of their property after the Smoky Mountains became a national park. The lumber company sold 76,000 acres of land to the government, including Elkmont. Others who were not within the boundaries of the park were forced to leave their homes. In 1952, these leases were changed to 20-year leases, which were renewed in 1972. When 1992 rolled around, leases were up and the National Park Service was legally able to demolish the homes. Unfortunately for them, that just wasn't possible, as the property was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. The Wonderland Hotel caught fire and eventually collapsed in 2005 and was cleaned up by the National Park Service employees. They left the rest of the structures behind for the forest to take over. Thanks for watching. Which one of these discoveries was your favorite? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.